and it can be hard to remember all of them or to know all of them. Some teachers will give you as many as 4 pages of rules. If you look in the Bible, we did a study on this recently. There are, by the count of the rabbis, 613 laws in the Old Testament. But don't worry, it doesn't stop there. They've added many, many, many more rules and traditions to supplement those laws, because if all you have is 613, that's almost chaos. You need more. How do we know how to deal with these? How do we know what laws we follow and what laws we don't need to worry about? Because honestly, when you look at some of the laws in the Bible, they tend to follow in 3 categories. They're the laws that, like Anna was talking about, that make perfect sense. Don't kill. That's an easy one. Don't steal. Don't lie. Then there are the laws that they're just kind of strange. You can eat an insect that walks upright on its all legs, but don't eat one that crawls on its belly. There are laws about wearing blended fabric and trimming the hair on your the sides of your face. There are laws about, you can't have somebody standing at the altar who's got weak vision. Obviously, we don't take all these laws with equal seriousness, and some laws we don't think are even good laws, even though they're in the Bible. For example, in Exodus, there's a law about the process you need to go through when you're selling your daughter into slavery. Don't do that. So how do we know? Well, there are 3 basic approaches. One, you can try to follow every single law in the Bible, and there are people who, both in Christianity and Judaism, who say that they want to do this, that we need to live according to each and every rule in the Bible, and not just all those Old Testament rules, but every little piece of advice that Paul or Jesus ever gave is to be treated as an absolute and inflexible rule. And you can only make God happy by following them all perfectly. They don't follow him perfectly. It's not really possible to follow them all perfectly. They're just too many, and it takes all of your time and all of your energy. And when you focus all of your time and all of your energy that way, it can actually kind of make you a pretty rotten person. Kind of mean-spirited and legalistic. Well, the second way is you could ignore them all. Rules are for suckers. You know that rules are wrong if you've ever eaten at the Outback Steakhouse, where their motto is no rules, just right. As Americans, we like the idea of no rules. But if we didn't have rules, we'd have a much more dangerous world. I mean, imagine a world without traffic laws. I mean, if you didn't have a 35-mile-an-hour speed limit, people would probably exceed the 45 miles that everyone goes all the time. Life could be chaos without any rules at all. So what most of us do is we pick and choose. And there's a danger there too, because what you can tend to do is pick the rules that you like and avoid the rules that you don't like. So I'm doing okay because there are a lot of rules in the Old Testament, like don't eat shellfish and so on, that they just make no sense. I'm not bound by those. Oh, but you, if you're violating something that I do think is a rule, well, that's different. You can make yourself the measure of all truth when you do that. You can say, I'm following the Bible, when you're actually following your own prejudices. And it's not a good way to live. But there is, I think, a fourth way, a way that we see in our story about Jesus from the scripture this morning. Jesus was with the crowds. Jesus is almost always with the crowds. And he had been teaching and preaching and doing good things for them. And it was time for a meal. And so they began to eat together. And the Pharisees, some of the Pharisees in the audience, because Pharisees like to keep a close eye on Jesus. I think some of them probably really liked the things he had to say. And some of them were there because, you want to keep a good eye on somebody so you can have a little ammunition against them. And it was a couple of those who said, Jesus, this is wrong. Your disciples are eating and they haven't washed their hands. Make them stop. How dare you violate the traditions of the elders like this? That's against the rules. In fairness, they've kind of got a point about washing your hands before you eat. I mean, how many people have that rule in their house? Yeah. We had that rule, especially if they're kids, because kids don't think about that sort of thing, and kids will come in with all kinds of stuff on their hands. My parents were very strict about it. Wash your hands before you come to the dinner table. And if on the way from washing your hands to the dinner table you meet a dog that really needs to be petted, go back and wash your hands again. Doesn't matter if it's a good dog, there are germs there and you want to wash your hands. Now see, we have a good rationale for that rule. You don't want to eat with dirty hands, because dirty hands or a dirty plate may be contaminated. They may have germs, and germs can cause disease. So this rule that we have about washing your hands is really to preserve people's health. However, as kids, we came up with ways to maybe argue with it, because that's what kids do. It's actually probably what grown-ups do too. When you're given a rule, you try to find a way around the rule. And so we would say, well, I think the dogs are clean. Or as we got older, the arguments became more sophisticated. We'd say things like, well, studies have shown that the immune system in children develops best when they're exposed to a variety of possible infections over their lifetime, and by being meticulous about being clean and washing your hands and not playing in the mud and not letting the dog lick your hands clean instead of doing it with soap and water, you're keeping us from developing a proper immune system, because we never get exposed to anything to make it stronger. To which my parents had a second position: do it because I said so. That one's harder to argue with. I don't know exactly where the rule for there are rules about the priest at the altar must be ritually clean and wash his hands, and I wasn't able to trace that one farther back. But there are maybe reasons for rules. Another rule in the Old Testament has to do with cheeseburgers. Specifically, don't eat cheeseburgers. You may not find it in that language in the Bible, but I've studied this online and I'm told it's there. Cheeseburgers are not kosher. And that's one of these rules that has come down from antiquity and makes it hard to take ultra-Orthodox Jewish friends to McDonald's. That rule, there are a couple of reasons given for that rule. One is that there actually is no rule, but if we love God, we should do whatever God asks us to, even if we don't understand the reason. Because if you only follow rules because, one, they make sense, and two, there's some benefit to you, well, you're not really showing your love. You're just acting in your own self-interest. And so God puts down rules that have no reason behind them at all. It's just like, well, on Tuesdays, tacos will be cheaper, thus saith the Lord. There's no reason. You just do it. I can kind of see that argument, except that so much of what we see in the Bible, and especially so much of what we see from Jesus, says that questioning is not wrong. That arguing and testing and finding the limits and growing, even if we're testing the limits of God, is not a bad thing. It's a necessary part of the process of our faith growing. We don't want to stay like obedient children forever. We want to grow into the kinds of mature individuals who do the right thing, because we can see the world through God's eyes and we understand why it's the right thing. So I think this other answer I found is superior. It says that, well, first it elaborates on the rules. It says, not only can you not have a bacon cheeseburger, or a cheeseburger, well, bacon would just be adding a whole new level of unkosher to it. Forget I said bacon. But you're not supposed to serve meat and dairy together. And there are a lot of rules built around this that come out of tradition. If you eat meat, you have to wait, I think it's 12 hours before you have any dairy, or vice versa. And not only can you not serve them together in one food item, but you can't serve them together on the same plate, or you can't serve them together at the same meal. You can't cook them together in the same oven. And I don't mean you can't cook them together at the same time, because if you ever cook meat in your oven, there may be some minuscule trace of it that if you ever cooked something that had dairy in it would contaminate the dairy with a trace of meat. So you need to have two stoves. You need to have two refrigerators, because you can't store them together, obviously. You need to have two sets of dishes, because, if you serve one and then use the same dish later, even after you've washed it to serve the other, then there's the chance of contamination. And this would break the rules. Can't use the same utensils. It's a very elaborate set of laws, all designed to make sure we don't eat meat and dairy together. Now, if you look for meat and dairy in the Old Testament, you won't find that exact rule. It is, I wrote this down so I could give you the exact scripture. It comes from Leviticus 29, verse 19b, which says, "You shall not boil a kid." Don't worry, this is a baby goat in this case. "You shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk," which is an interesting rule. It's very specific. It doesn't say don't boil meat in goat milk. It doesn't say don't boil a kid in some other kind of milk. It doesn't even say don't boil it in some other animal's milk. It says don't boil it in its mother's milk. Why is it so exact? Well, we don't know for sure, but it looks like there are two reasons: cruelty and idolatry. Cruelty, well, when you think about it, boiling a kid in its mother's milk, doesn't that just sound mean? The mother's milk is meant to give life, and yet by doing this, you're kind of taking the milk and making it complicit in the animal's death. And that just really, there's a principle in Jewish traditional law that you're not to be cruel to a mother of any species. You don't break the eggs in front of the chicken that laid them. And it sounds kind of silly, but when you think about it, there's really something kind of nasty about taking the chicken's eggs and breaking them in front of her. There's this idea that we don't want to be cruel, not to any person, not to any living creature. The other is more obscure, but we do have some evidence that in some of the pagan Near Eastern religions of ancient times, of the Canaanites and the other people who lived in that area, there was a fertility ritual where you would take a baby goat, a kid, boil it in its mother's milk, and then sprinkle the milk on the fields. It was a ritual that was supposed to provide fertile crops. And so if you boil a kid in its mother's milk, you're doing something that looks like possibly you're honoring foreign gods rather than loving and serving the one God of Israel. And those two things, you see them all the time. They go together. If you look through the books of the prophets, there are always two things that go side by side. Don't be cruel. And it's usually being cruel to the poor, to the widows, to the orphans, to the foreigners living among you. But don't be cruel to anyone. And don't chase after foreign gods, because those two things seem to go together in those cultures, that the worshipers of foreign gods often did things. And so the prophets will constantly say, don't do these two things. Don't be cruel. Don't chase after other gods. The law at its heart is pretty simple. But in order to keep the law, because the law is important, we elaborate on it. We build what the rabbis call a hedge around the law. Extra laws added in so that you don't even get close to, if you don't keep cheese and meat in the same refrigerator or eat them with the same silverware, you're so far away from boiling a kid in its mother's milk that you're just never even going to think about doing that. But by adding so many layers onto the law, maybe you've forgotten what the point of the law was, and now you think it's about meat and dairy and what I'm supposed to eat, and not about cruelty and idolatry. As I said, I don't know what the rationale was originally for washing your hands. It wasn't germ theory, because the Pharisees did not know about that. Nobody living in the ancient world knew about germ theory. For them, it was kind of one of these, well, we've always done it that way before laws. We do it because our ancestors did it, and their ancestors did it, and it goes way, way back, and don't even ask, because I said so. And because I said so is wonderful. Because if I can tell you what to do, and I can say, because I said so, and I'm the preacher, that gives me a lot of authority. That gives me a lot of power. And that gives me a lot of temptation to abuse that power for my own purposes. And that's maybe not a great thing. Jesus saw that, and he said, you guys, what you've done is you've taken a rule, a law, and you've built all these layers around it until the only thing that's important are the layers. The only thing that's important are the rules. The only thing that's important are people have to obey you without questioning. I'll tell you this. It's not what goes into your mouth that makes you unclean in God's sight, he said. It doesn't matter where you buy your food or what kind of food it is or how it's been prepared. Maybe just a little bit because you don't want to undercook pork but that's not what makes you unclean in God's eyes. You may get trichinosis, but you will not be clean in God's eyes. And it's not who you eat with, because this is one of those times when Jesus was accused of flaunting the law, when he was by the Pharisees. Other times were when he healed on the Sabbath, because you're not supposed to work on the Sabbath. When he ate with sinners and tax collectors, because those people are unclean and they'll contaminate you just by being around the same table as you. He said, no, none of those things makes you unclean. What makes you unclean is not what goes in, it's what comes out of your mouth. If you're deceiving people, if you're telling lies, if you're bearing false witness against your neighbors, if you're using the name of God to justify hatred and violence and intolerance, you are making yourself unclean in God's eyes. What comes out is so much more important than what goes in. I think what Jesus wants us to do in so much of his ministry, he wants us not to just follow every point and every letter of the law, but he wants us to get to the heart of the law. He wants to take all those hedges, those laws about cheeseburgers and bacon and so on, and get past them, because they're all supposed to be a reflection of those 613 laws, and he wants us to take those and get past them, because those laws are all elaborations of the 10 laws that you saw in the children's time, the 10 laws that God gave Moses from Mount Sinai. And if you look at those laws, they really come down to 2. The first 4 are about having a just and loving relation with God, a righteous relationship with God. And the last 6, I had a pastor who taught me this. He said, well, there are probably 4 for God and 6 for people, because people are where you really need to do a lot of work. People are tricky. The last 6 are, how do we treat our neighbors with compassion, with justice, with respect? How do we love God and love all the good things in the world that God has given us? How do we become caretakers? How do we act in such a way that God would be proud of us for being so compassionate, so caring, so honest, so just? And how do we love our neighbors as ourselves? And by neighbors, and Jesus makes this clear in a couple of parables, neighbors doesn't mean the people who just live around you. It doesn't mean just your family and friends. It doesn't mean just your church. It doesn't mean just your religion, just your country. Neighbors means everyone. It doesn't even mean just people you like and approve of. Show kindness. Fight for justice for all people. Even those people, and hopefully that will be returned to you, but even when it's not, show kindness and do good anyway. Because it is right. Because that is the way we love and honor God. The law is complicated, the law is tricky, and there's probably no way around it. We have laws, we probably will always have laws. What do we do with them? Jesus said there are 2 guideposts, and you'll notice these are the same 2 things that led to not eating cheeseburgers. Don't be cruel. Don't be idolatrous. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and mind and strength and spirit. Love your neighbor as yourself. Do this, and you don't need to worry about all the details of the law, because you will fulfill it.